He didn't realize it, but he was making an enormous impression. Only a great writer could have taken so arrogant, so original a line. Several people wrote Zane Grey's name on the backs of envelopes, and Greyfind whispered hoarsely to Crabbin, "How do you spell Zane?" To tell you the truth, I'm not quite sure." A number of names were simultaneously flung at Martins, little sharp-pointed names like Stein, round pebbles like Rolf. A young Austrian with an intellectual black forelock called out, "Daphne du Maurier!" And Mr. Crabbins winced and looked sideways at Martins. He said in an undertone, "Be gentle with them." A kind-faced woman in a hand-knitted jumper said wistfully, "Don't you agree, Mr. Dexter, that no one has written about feelings so poetically as Virginia Woolf? In prose, I mean." A note of despair came into Crabbins's voice. "Please, Mr. Dexter, these people are your genuine admirers. They want to hear your views. If you knew how they have besieged the Institute." An elderly Austrian said, "Is there any writer in England today of the stature of the late John Galsworthy?" There was an outburst of angry twitterings in which the names of Du Maurier, Priestley, and somebody called Lehman were flung to and fro. Martin sat gloomily back and saw again the snow, the stretcher, the desperate face of Frau Koch. He thought, if I had never returned, if I had never asked questions, would that little man still be alive? How had he benefited Harry by supplying another victim? A victim to assuage the fear of whom? Herr Kurtz, Colonel Kuhle, Dr. Winkler? Not one of them seemed adequate to the drab, gruesome crime in the basement. Martin could not have said how he got through the rest of the discussion. Perhaps Crabbin took the brunt. Perhaps he was helped by some of the audience who got into an animated discussion about a film version of a popular American novel. He remembered very little more before Crabbin was making a final speech in his honor. Then one of the young men led him to a table stacked with books and asked him to sign them. "We have only allowed each member one book. What have I got to do?" "Just a signature. That's all they expect. This is my copy of The Curved Prow. I would be so grateful if you just write a little something." Martins took his pen and wrote, "From B. Dexter, author of The Lone Rider from Santa Fe." The young man read the sentence and blotted it with a puzzled expression. As Martin sat down and started signing Benjamin Dexter's title pages, he could see in a mirror the young man showing the inscription to Crabbin. Crabbin smiled weakly and stroked his chin up and down, up and down. "B. Dexter, B. Dexter, B. Dexter," Martins wrote rapidly. It was not, after all, a lie. Martins began to feel distinct irritation towards Benjamin Dexter. The complacent, tiring, pompous ass, he thought, signing the 27th copy of The Curved Prow. Every time he looked up and took another book, he saw Crabbin's worried, speculative gaze. Members of the Institute were beginning to go home with their spoils. The room was emptying. Suddenly, in the mirror, Martin saw a military policeman. He seemed to be having an argument with one of Crabbin's young henchmen. Martin thought he caught the sound of his own name. It was then he lost his nerve, and with it any relic of common sense. There was only one book left to sign. He dashed off at last B. Dexter and made for the door. The young man, Crabbin, and the policeman stood together at the entrance. "And this gentleman?" the policeman asked. "It's Mr. Benjamin Dexter," the young man said. "A lavatory, is there a lavatory?" Martin said. "I understand Mr. Rollo Martins came here in one of your cars." "A mistake, an obvious mistake." "Second door on the left," the young man said. Martins grabbed his coat from the cloakroom as he went and made down the stairs. On the first-floor landing, he heard someone mounting the stairs and, looking over, saw Payne, whom I had sent to identify him. He opened a door at random and shut it behind him. He could hear Payne going by. The room where he stood was in darkness. A curious moaning sound made him turn and face whatever room it was. He could see nothing, and the sound had stopped. He made a tiny movement, and once more it started, like an impeded breath. It remained still, and the sound died away. Outside, somebody called, "Mr. Dexter! Mr. Dexter!" Then a new sound started. It was like somebody whispering, a long, continuous monologue in the darkness. Martin said, "Anybody there?" The sound stopped again. He could stand no more of it. He took out his lighter. Footsteps went by and down the stairs. He scraped and scraped at the little wheel, and no light came. Somebody shifted in the darkness, and something rattled in mid-air like a chain. He asked once more with the anger of fear, "Is anybody there?" And only the click-click of metal answered him. Martin felt desperately for a light switch, first to his right hand and then to his left. He did not dare go farther because he could no longer locate his fellow occupant. The whisper, the moaning, the click had all stopped. Then he was afraid that he had lost the door and felt wildly for the knob. He was far less afraid of the police than he was of the darkness, and he had no idea of the noise he was making. Payne heard it from the bottom of the stairs and came back. He switched on the landing light, and the glow under the door gave Martins the direction. He opened the door and, smiling weakly at Payne, turned back to take a second look at the room. The eyes of a parrot chained to a perch stared beadily back at him. Payne said respectfully, "We were looking for you, sir. Colonel Calloway wants a word with you." "I lost my way," Martin said. "Yes, sir. We thought that was what had happened." I had kept a very careful record of Martin's movement from the moment I knew that he had not caught the plane home. He had been seen with Kurtz and at the Josefstadt Theatre. I knew about his visit to Dr. Winkler and to Colonel Cooler, his first return to the block where Harry had lived. For some reason, my man lost him between Cooler's and Anna Schmidt's flats. He reported that Martins had wandered widely, and the impression we both got was that he had deliberately thrown off his shadower. I tried to pick him up at the hotel and just missed him. Events had taken a disquieting turn, and it seemed to me that the time had come for another interview. He had a lot to explain. I put a good wide desk between us and gave him a cigarette. I found him sullen, but ready to talk within strict limits. I asked him about Kurtz, and he seemed to me to answer satisfactorily. I then asked him about Anna Schmidt, and I gathered from his reply that he must have been with her after visiting Colonel Cooler. That filled in one of the missing points. I tried him with Dr. Winkler, and he answered readily enough. "You've been getting around," I said. "Quite a bit. And have you found out anything about your friend?" "Oh, yes," he said. "It was under your nose, but you didn't see it." "What?" "That he was murdered." That took me by surprise. I had at one time played with the idea of suicide, but I had ruled even that out. "Go on," I said. He tried to eliminate from his story all mention of Koch, talking about an informant who had seen the accident. This made his story rather confusing, and I couldn't grasp at first why he attached so much importance to the third man. "He didn't turn up at the inquest, and the others lied to keep him out." "Nor did your man turn up. I don't see much importance in that. If it was a genuine accident, all the evidence needed was there. Why get the other chap into trouble? Perhaps his wife thought he was out of town. Perhaps he was an official, absent without leave. People sometimes take unauthorized trips to Vienna from places like Klagenfurt, the delights of the great city for what they're worth." "There was more to it than that. The little chap who told me about it, they've murdered him. You see, they obviously didn't know what else he had seen." "Now we have it," I say. "You mean Koch?" "Yes. As far as we know, you were the last person to see him alive." I questioned him then, as I've written, to find out if he had been followed to Koch's by somebody who was sharper than my man and had kept out of sight. I said, "The Austrian police are anxious to pin this on you. Frau Koch told them how disturbed her husband was by your visit. Who else knew about it?" "I told Cooler," he said excitedly. "Suppose immediately after I left he telephoned the story to someone. to a third man. They had to stop Koch's mouth. When you told Colonel Cooler about Koch, the man was already dead. That night you got out of bed, hearing someone, and went downstairs. Well, that rules me out. I was at Sacher's. But he went to bed very early. Your visit brought back the migraine. It was soon after 9 when he got up. You returned to Sacher's at 9:30. Where were you before that? He said gloomily, wandering around and trying to sort things out. Any evidence of your movements? No. I wanted to frighten him, so there was no point in telling him that he had been followed all the time. I knew that he hadn't cut Koch's throat, but I wasn't sure that he was quite so innocent as he made out. The man who owns the knife is not always the real murderer. Can I have another cigarette? Yes. He said, how did you know that I went to Koch's? That was why you pulled me in here, wasn't it? Immediately you left Colonel Cooler's, he telephoned to me. Then that lets him out. If he had been concerned, he wouldn't have wanted me to tell you my story. To tell Koch's story, I mean. He might assume that you were a sensible man and would come to me with your story as soon as you learned of Koch's death. By the way, how did you learn of it? He told me promptly, and I believed him. It was then I began to believe him altogether. He said, I still can't believe Cooler's concerned. I'd stake anything on his honesty. He's one of those Americans with a real sense of duty. Yes, I said. He told me about that when he phoned. He apologized for it. He said it was the worst of having been brought up to believe in citizenship. He said it made him feel a prig. To tell you the truth, Cooler irritates me, because he doesn't know that I know about his tire deals. Is he in a racket too, then? Not a very serious one. I dare say he's salted away $25,000, but I'm not a good citizen. Let the Americans look after their own people. I'm damned, he said thoughtfully. Is that the kind of thing Harry was up to? No, it was not quite so harmless. He said, you know, this business, Koch's death, has shaken me. Perhaps Harry did get mixed up in something bad. Perhaps he was trying to clear out again, and that's why they murdered him. Or perhaps, I said, they wanted a bigger cut of the spoils. Thieves fall out. He took it this time without any anger at all. He said, we won't agree about motives, but I think you check your facts pretty well. I'm sorry about the other day. That's all right. There are times when one has to make a flash decision. This was one of them. I owed him something in return for the information he had given me. I said, I'll show you enough of the facts in Lime's case for you to understand, but don't fly off the handle. It's going to be a shock. Couldn't help being a shock. The war and the peace, if you can call it peace, let loose a great number of rackets, but none more vile than this one. The black marketeers in food did at least supply food, and the same applied to all the other racketeers who provided articles in short supply at extravagant prices. But the penicillin racket was a different affair altogether. Penicillin in Austria was supplied only to the military hospitals. No civilian doctor, not even a civilian hospital, could obtain it by legal means. As the racket started, it was relatively harmless. Penicillin would be stolen by military orderlies and sold to Austrian doctors for very high sums. A phial would fetch anything up to £70. You might say that this was a form of distribution. Unfair distribution because it benefited only the rich patient. But the original distribution could hardly have a claim to greater fairness. This racket went on quite happily for a while. Occasionally an orderly was caught and punished, but the danger simply raised the price of penicillin. Then the racket began to get organized. The big men saw big money in it, and while the original thief got less for his spoils, he received instead a certain security. If anything happened to him, he would be looked after. This I've sometimes called Stage 2. Stage 3 was when the organizers decided that the profits were not large enough. Penicillin would not always be impossible to obtain legitimately. They wanted more money and quicker money while the going was good. They began to dilute the penicillin with coloured water, and, in the case of penicillin dust, with sand. I keep a small museum in one drawer of my desk, and I showed Martin's examples. I said, "At the best, you can say that the use of this stuff makes a penicillin treatment for the particular patient ineffective in the future. That isn't so funny, of course, if you are suffering from VD. Then the use of sand on a wound that requires penicillin, well, it's not healthy. Men have lost their legs and arms that way, and their lives. But perhaps what horrified me most was visiting the children's hospital here. They had bought some of this penicillin for use against meningitis. A number of children simply died. A number went off their heads. You can see them now in the mental ward." He sat on the other side of the desk, scowling into his hand. I said, "It doesn't bear thinking about very closely, does it?" "You haven't shown me any evidence yet that Harry—" "We're coming to that now," I said. "Just sit still and listen." I opened Lime's file and began to read. At the beginning, the evidence was purely circumstantial, and Martins fidgeted. So much consisted of coincidence, reports from agents that Lime had been at a certain place at a certain time, the accumulation of opportunities, his acquaintance with certain people. He protested once, "But the same evidence could apply against me, now." "Just wait," I said. For some reason, Harry Lime had grown careless. He may have realized that we suspected him and got rattled. He held a quite distinguished position in the relief organization, and a man like that is the more easily rattled. We put one of our agents as an orderly in the British Military Hospital. We knew by this time the name of our go-between, but we had never succeeded in getting the line right back to the source. Anyway, I'm not going to bother the reader now, as I bothered Martins then, with all the stages, the long tussle to win the confidence of the go-between, a man called Harbin. At last we had the screws on Harbin, and we twisted them until he squealed. This kind of police work is very similar to Secret Service work. You look for a double agent whom you can really control, and Harbin was the man for us. But even he only led us as far as Kurtz. "Kurtz!" Martins exclaimed. "But why haven't you pulled him in?" 0 hour is almost here," I said. Kurtz was a great step forward, for Kurtz was in direct communication with Lime. He had a small outside job in connection with international relief. With Kurtz, Lime sometimes put things on paper, if he was pressed. I showed Martins the photostat of a note. "Can you identify that?" "It's Harry's hand." He read it through. "I don't see anything wrong." "No, but now read this note from Harbin to Kurtz, which we dictated. Look at the date. This is the result." He read them both through twice. "You see what I mean? If one watched a world come to an end, a plane dive from its course, I don't suppose one would chatter. And a world for Martins had certainly come to an end, a world of easy friendship, hero worship, confidence that had begun 20 years before in a school corridor. Every memory, afternoons in the long grass, the illegitimate shoots on Brickworth Common, the dreams, the walks, every shared experience was simultaneously tainted, like the soil of an atomized town. While he sat there, looking at his hands and saying nothing, I fetched a precious bottle of whiskey out of a cupboard and poured out 2 large doubles. "Go on," I said, "drink that." And he obeyed me as though I were his doctor. I poured him out another. He said slowly, "Are you certain that he was the real boss?" "It's as far back as we've got so far. You see, he was always apt to jump before he looked. I didn't contradict him, though that wasn't the impression he had before given me of Lime. He was searching around for some comfort. Suppose, he said, someone had got a line on him, forced him into this racket, as you forced Harbin to double-cross. Huh? It's possible. And they murdered him, in case he talked when he was arrested. It's not impossible. I'm glad they did, he said. I wouldn't have liked to hear Harry squeal. He made a curious little dusting movement with his hand on his knee, as much as to say, "That's that." He said, "I'll be getting back to England." "I'd rather you didn't just yet. The Austrian police would make an issue if you tried to leave Vienna at the moment. You see, Cooler's sense of duty made him call them up, too." "I see," he said hopelessly. "When we found the third man," I said. "I'd like to hear him squeal," he said. "The bastard! The bloody bastard!" After he left me, Martins went straight off to drink himself silly. He chose the Oriental to do it in, the dreary, smoky little nightclub that stands behind a sham eastern facade. Martins had drink after drink. He would probably have had a woman, too, but the cabaret performers had all gone home, and there were practically no women left in the place, except for one beautiful, shrewd-looking French journalist who made one remark to her companion and fell contemptuously asleep. Martins moved on. At Maxim's, a few couples were dancing rather gloomily, and at a place called Chez Victor, the heating had failed and people sat in overcoats drinking cocktails. By this time the spots were swimming in front of Martin's eyes, and he was oppressed by a sense of loneliness. The trams had stopped, and he set out obstinately on foot to find Harry's girl. He wanted to make love to her, just like that. No nonsense, no sentiment. He was in the mood for violence, and the snowy road heaved like a lake and set his mind on a new course towards sorrow, eternal love, renunciation. In the corner of a sheltering wall he was sick in the snow. It must have been about 3 in the morning when he climbed the stairs to Anna's room. He was nearly sober by that time and had only one idea in his head, that she must know about Harry too. He felt that somehow this knowledge would pay the mortmain that memory levies on human beings, and he would stand a chance with Harry's girl. If you're in love yourself, it never occurs to you that the girl doesn't know. You believe that you have told it plainly in a tone of voice, the touch of a hand. When Anna opened the door to him, with astonishment at the sight of him tousled on the threshold, he never imagined that she was opening the door to a stranger. He said, "Anna, I found out everything." "Come in," she said. "You don't want to wake the house." She was in a dressing gown. The divan had become a bed, the kind of tumbled bed that showed how sleepless the occupant had been. "Now," she said, while he stood there fumbling for words, "what is it? I thought you were going to keep away. Are the police after you?" "No." "You didn't really kill that man, did you?" "Of course not." "You're drunk, aren't you?" "I am a bit," he said sulkily. The meeting seemed to be going on the wrong lines. He said angrily, "I'm sorry." "Why? I would like a drink myself." He said, "I've been with the British police. They're satisfied I didn't do it, but I've learned everything from them. Harry was in a racket, a bad racket." He said hopelessly, "He was no good at all. We were both wrong." "You'd better tell me," Anna said. She sat down on the bed and he told her. I imagine he told it to her pretty confusedly, dwelling chiefly on what had stuck most in his mind, the children dead with meningitis and the children in the mental ward. He stopped, and they were silent. She said, "Is that all?" "Yes." "You were sober when they told you? They really proved it?" "Yes," he said drearily. "So that, you see, was Harry." "I'm glad he's dead now," she said. "I wouldn't have wanted him to rot for years in prison." "But can you understand how Harry, your Harry, my Harry, could have got mixed up?" he said hopelessly. "I feel as though he had never really existed, that we dreamed him. Was he laughing at fools like us all the time?" "He may have been." "What does it matter?" she said. "Sit down, don't worry." He had pictured himself comforting her, not this other way about. She said, "If he was alive now, He might be able to explain, but we've got to remember him as he was to us. There are always so many things one doesn't know about a person, even a person one loves, good things, bad things. We have to leave plenty of room for them. Those children, she said angrily. For God's sake, stop making people in your image. Harry was real. He wasn't just your hero and my lover. He was Harry. He was in a racket. He did bad things. What about it? He was the man we knew. He said, don't talk such bloody wisdom. Don't you see that I love you? She looked at him in astonishment. You? Yes, me. I don't kill people with fake drugs. I'm not a hypocrite who persuades people that I'm the greatest. I'm just a bad writer who drinks too much and falls in love with girls. She said, but I don't even know what color your eyes are. If you'd rung me up just now and asked me whether you were dark or fair or wore a moustache, I wouldn't have known. Can't you get him out of your mind? No? He said, as soon as they've cleared up this Koch murder, I'm leaving Vienna. I can't feel interested any longer in whether Kurtz killed Harry or the third man. Whoever killed him, it was a kind of justice. Maybe I'd kill him myself under these circumstances. But you still love him. You love a cheat, a murderer. I loved a man, she said. I told you. A man doesn't alter because you find out more about him. He's still the same man. I hate the way you talk. I've got a splitting headache and you talk and talk. I didn't ask you to come. You make me cross. Suddenly she laughed. She said, you're so comic. You come here at 3 o'clock in the morning, a stranger, and you say you love me. Then you get angry and pick a quarrel. What do you expect me to do? Or say? I haven't seen you laugh before. Do it again, I like it. There isn't enough for 2 laughs, she said. He took her by the shoulders and shook her gently. He said, I'd make comic faces all day long. I'd stand on my head and grin at you between my legs. I'd learn a lot of jokes from the books on after-dinner speaking. Come away from the window. There are no curtains. There's nobody to see. But automatically checking his statement, he wasn't quite so sure. The long shadow that had moved, perhaps with the movement of the clouds over the moon, was motionless again. He said, you still love Harry, don't you? Yes. Perhaps I do. I don't know. He dropped his hands and said, I'll be pushing off. He walked rapidly away. He didn't bother to see whether he was being followed, to check up on the shadow, but passing by the end of a street, he happened to turn, and there, just around the corner, pressed against a wall to escape notice, was a thick, stocky figure. Martin stopped and stared. There was something familiar about that figure. Perhaps, he thought, I've grown unconsciously used to him during these last 24 hours. Perhaps he's one of those who have so assiduously checked my movements. Martin stood there 20 yards away, staring at the silent, motionless figure in the dark street who stared back at him. A police spy, perhaps? Or an agent of those other men, those men who had corrupted Harry first and then killed him, even possibly the third man. It was not the face that was familiar, for he could not make out so much as the angle of the jaw, nor a movement, for the body was so still that he began to believe that the whole thing was an illusion caused by a shadow. He called out sharply, "Do you want anything?" There was no reply. He called again with the irascibility of drink. "Answer, can't you?" And an answer came, for a window curtain was drawn petulantly back by some sleeper he had awakened, and the light fell straight across the narrow street and lit up the features of Harry Lyme. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Martin said to me. "Do you?" "I do now. I also believe that drunk men see things, sometimes rats, sometimes worse." He hadn't come to me at once with his story. Only the danger to Anna Schmidt had tossed him back into my office, like something the sea had washed up, tousled, unshaven, haunted by an experience he couldn't understand. He said, "If it had been just a face, I wouldn't have worried. I've been thinking about Harry, and I might easily have mistaken a stranger. The light was turned off again at once, you see. I only got one glimpse, and the man made off down the street, if he was a man. There was no turning for a long way, but I was so startled I gave him another 30-yard start. He came to one of those advertisement kiosks, and for a moment moved out of sight. I ran after him. It only took me 10 seconds to reach the kiosk, and he must have heard me running, but the strange thing was he never appeared again. I reached the kiosk. Wasn't anybody there. The street was empty. Couldn't have reached the doorway without my seeing him. He simply vanished. Natural thing for ghosts, or illusions. But I can't believe I was drunk as all that. What did you do then? I had to have another drink. My nerves were all in pieces. Didn't that bring him back? No, but it sent me back to Anna's. I think he would have been ashamed to come to me with his absurd story if it had not been for the attempt on Anna Schmidt. My theory when he did tell me his story was that there had been a watcher, though it was drink and hysteria that had pasted on the man's face the features of Harry Lyme. The watcher had noted his visit to Anna, and the member of the ring, the penicillin ring, had been warned by telephone. Events that night moved fast. You must understand that at this period cooperation between the Western Allies and the Russians had practically, though not yet completely, broken down. The original police agreement in Vienna between the Allies confined the military police, who had to deal with crimes involving Allied personnel, to their particular zones, unless permission was given to them to enter the zone of another power. This agreement worked well enough between the three Western powers. I only had to get on the phone to my opposite number in the American or French zones before I sent in my men to make an arrest or pursue an investigation. During the first 6 months of the occupation, it had worked reasonably well with the Russians. Perhaps 48 hours would pass before I received permission, and in practice there are few occasions when it is necessary to work quicker than that. Even at home it's not always possible to obtain a search warrant or permission from one's superiors to detain a suspect with any greater speed. Then the 48 hours turned into a week or a fortnight. I remember my American colleague suddenly taking a look at his records and discovering that there were 40 cases dating back more than 3 months where not even an acknowledgement of his request had been received. Then the trouble started. We began to turn down, or not answer, the Russian requests, and sometimes without permission they would send in police, and there were clashes. At the date of this story, the Western powers had more or less ceased to put in applications or reply to the Russian ones. This meant that if I wanted to pick up Kurtz, it would be as well to catch him outside the Russian zone. Though, of course, it was always possible his activities might offend the Russians, and his punishment be more sudden and severe than any we would inflict. Well, the Anna Schmidt case was one of the clashes. When Rollo Martins went drunkenly back at 4 o'clock in the morning to tell Anna that he had seen the ghost of Harry, he was told by a frightened porter, who had not yet gone back to sleep, that she had been taken away by the International Patrol. What happened was this. Russia, you remember, was in the chair as far as the Innere Stadt was concerned, and when Russia was in the chair, you expected certain irregularities. On this occasion, halfway through the patrol, the Russian policeman pulled a fast one on his colleagues and directed the car to the street where Anna Schmidt lived. The British military policeman that night was new to his job. He didn't realize, till his colleagues told him, that they had entered a British zone. Outside Anna Schmidt's block, the American took a hand in the game and demanded in German what it was all about. The Frenchman leaned against the bonnet and lit a stinking caporal. France wasn't concerned, and anything that didn't concern France had no genuine importance to him. The Russian dug out a few words of German and flourished some papers. As far as they could tell, a Russian national wanted by the Russian police was living there without proper papers. They went upstairs and the Russian tried Anna's door. It was firmly bolted, but he put his shoulder to it and tore out the bolt without giving the occupant an opportunity of letting him in. Anna was in bed, though I don't suppose after Martin's visit that she was asleep. There's a lot of comedy in these situations if you're not directly concerned. You need a background of Central European terror or a father who belonged to a losing side, of house searches and disappearances before the fear outweighs the comedy. The Russian, you see, refused to leave the room while Anna dressed. The Englishman refused to remain in the room. The American wouldn't leave the girl unprotected with a Russian soldier, and the Frenchman, well, I think the Frenchman must have thought it was fun. Can't you imagine the scene? The Russian was just doing his duty and watched the girl all the time without a flicker of sexual interest. The American stood with his back chivalrously turned, but aware, I am sure, of every movement. The Frenchman smoked his cigarette and watched with detached amusement the reflection of the girl dressing in the mirror of the wardrobe, and the Englishman stood in the passage, wondering what to do next. I don't want you to think that the English policeman came too badly out of the affair. In the passage, undistracted by chivalry, he had time to think, and his thoughts led him to the telephone in the next flat. He got straight through to me at my flat and woke me out of that deepest middle sleep. That was why when Martins rang up an hour later, I already knew what was exciting him. It gave him an undeserved but very useful belief in my efficiency. I never heard another crack from him about policemen or sheriffs after that night. I must explain another point of police procedure. If the International Patrol made an arrest, they had to lodge their prisoner for 24 hours at the International headquarters. During that period it would be determined which power could justifiably claim the prisoner. It was this rule that the Russians were most ready to break. All this had to form the background of one's decision. I gave my instructions to Corporal Starling. When he came back to Anna's room, a dispute was raging. Anna had told the American that she had Austrian papers, which was true, and that they were quite in order, which was rather stretching the truth. The American told the Russian in bad German that they had no right to arrest an Austrian citizen. He asked Anna for her papers, and when she produced them, the Russian snatched them from her hand. "Hungarian," he said, pointing at Anna. "Hungarian," and then, flourishing the papers, "Bud, Bud." The American, whose name was O'Brien, said, "Give the girl back her papers," which the Russian naturally didn't understand. The American put his hand on his gun. Corporal Starling said gently, "Let it go, Pat. If those papers ain't in order, we got a right to look. Just let it go. We'll see the papers at HQ. If we get to HQ, we can't trust these Russian drivers. As like as not, he'll drive straight through to his zone." "We'll see," Starling said. "Trouble about you British is that you never know when to make a stand." "Oh, well," Starling said. He'd been at Dunkirk, but he knew when to be quiet. They got back into the car with Anna, who sat in the front between the two Russians, dumb with fear. After they'd gone a little way, the American touched the Russian on the shoulder. "Wrong way," he said. "HQ that way." The Russian chattered back in his own tongue, making a conciliatory gesture while they drove on. "It's what I said," O'Brien told Starling. "They're taking her to the Russian zone." Anna stared out with terror through the windscreen. "Don't worry, little girl," O'Brien said. "I'll fix them all right." His hand was fidgeting round his gun again. Starling said, "Look here, Pat, this is a British case. You don't have to get involved. You're new to this game. You don't know these bastards. It's not worth making an incident about." "For Christ's sake," O'Brien said, "not worth? That little girl's got to have protection." American chivalry is always, it seems to me, carefully canalized. One still awaits the American saint who will kiss a leper's sores. The driver put on his brakes suddenly. There was a roadblock. You see, I knew that they would have to pass this military post if they did not make their way to the international headquarters in the inner city. I put my head in at the window and said to the Russian, haltingly, in his own tongue, "What are you doing in the British zone?" He grumbled that it was orders. "Whose orders? Let me see them." I noted the signature. It was useful information. I said, "This tells you to pick up a certain Hungarian national and war criminal who was living with faulty papers in the British zone. Let me see the papers." He started on a long explanation, but I saw the papers sticking in his pocket and I pulled them out. He made a grab at his gun and I punched his face. I really felt mean at doing so, but it's the conduct they expect from an angry officer, and it brought him to reason. That, and seeing 3 British soldiers approaching his headlights. I said, "These papers look to me quite in order, but I'll investigate them and send a report of the result to your colonel. He can, of course, ask for the extradition of this lady at any time. All we want is proof of her criminal activities. I'm afraid we don't regard Hungarian as Russian nationality." He goggled at me. My Russian was probably half incomprehensible, and I said to Anna, "Get out of the car." She couldn't get by the Russian, so I had to pull him out first. Then I put a packet of cigarettes in his hand, said, "Have a good smoke," waved my hand to the others, gave a sigh of relief, and that incident was closed.